different samples, you're not, like, you're gonna get maybe a 50 out of 50% on the histo part of the test. And the histo part will probably be anywhere from 10 to 14 questions out of like 33, so that's decent. Okay, other than that, I'm on page 9. There's nothing on page 9 for you to actually answer. And it's mostly just introducing you to this topic of the tissues, which we did do in the first chapter. So what are the 4 primary tissues? Okay, connective tissues. Muscle. Epithelium and nervous. I'm not going to do, I don't think as of right now, I'm not going to do any nervous tissue in this lab. But we're starting with epithelium. And we also know from anatomy / chapter 1 that epithelium is characterized by the apical cells, their shape. What do I mean by apical? Maybe superior, but if it's a tube, superior doesn't. So it's the side facing the free surface, maybe the lumen of a tube, like a blood vessel. Or maybe it's your skin, in that case you can kind of think superficial. That's the layer that we're going to look at for shape. And we're on the same page with stratification, right? If I have 100 cells, is that simple or stratified? If I have 2 cell layers, is that simple or stratified? So anything in between 2 to 150, it's still stratified, but we're going to consider some of the other things we see to help us out. So what is this tissue, do you think? If you had to guess. This is what it looks like on the practical too, by the way. Because I will point and say ID. That's most of the questions you'll get. It's ID tissue. This is nothing we've said in the past 3 seconds. So what type of tissue?
Adipose?
Adipose. Good. Okay. One reason why you should know that is because of chapter 1. If you had anatomy, you should kind of know it because you've seen plenty of cartoons. So what organ do you think this is? This is my lowest magnification. Does this ring any bells? Maybe if I zoom in up here.
Is it
What?
the stomach?
No, that's a good idea. So here's the free surface all the way up here. Here's, I don't know, 150 cells before I go from purple to blue. So here's my epithelium, is all the pink and purple. What part of your anatomy requires hundreds of cells thick for just that epithelium part? Skin. Okay, so this is skin. Anatomy, if you've had it, you learn the 5 strata for thick skin. This is definitely thick skin. Again, on the test, I'm not going to say what organ is this, but I'm telling you that this is skin. Because I'm about to show you like 3 different types of epithelium, and while we're here, we also saw adipose. I'm probably going to mention some of the connective tissues, and it's all in the same slide. Which means that's bang for my buck on the practical, because I could load this up and ask you half of those 14 questions if I wanted to, because I know that this skin is where I look for stratified squamous, simple squamous, stratified cuboidal. Probably just those 3 for epithelium. So this is stratified squamous. That you do, if you're not taking notes yet, you should write down skin. Right? The slides will say skin probably. And you can just the heavily stratified squamous epithelium. I'm not necessarily going in any particular order, by the way, but this is number 2 on page 10, C2. It's also, I guess, D4. Okay. And we'll talk about what I expect for each of them. Actually, I guess let's talk about that now in case you want to kind of do it as we go a little bit. So for any of these questions that you're responsible for, make sure you read the description. So page 10, letter C, it says find the definition / description, and also list a few areas of the body where it's found. So if you give me a really good definition of simple squamous, but you don't tell me anywhere it's located, I'm taking full points off of that because I literally have to do this. Okay, but I understand like there's a lot, but double check the instructions because that's all I need is it. Whatever version of definition you come up with, stratified squamous looks like this, and it's made out of many layers of cells that are flat. Where do I find it? the skin is one place. Vaginal mucosa is another that I've got up here. Oral mucosa, esophagus, those are also the tongue, also stratified. So you might see those around and compare it to what you see here. But then you look at part D on page 10, D4. It says stratified squamous again, it lists it. Anything in parentheses is just suggestions. It's just saying maybe you go find a human scalp. But the instructions are for you to draw it. So it's not a definition and locations. It's okay, now go physically look at a quick scope. Give me a quick sketch. There's a few times in this class that we might do some drawings. I don't grade you on art. You've seen some of my drawings in lecture, or maybe in here. They're not great either. So what that translates to for the whole class, if you're giving me a drawing, also label 2 or 3 things, especially for this lab, Histo. So any of these that tell you to give me a drawing, do your worst drawing ever. It'll be fine, because then you're going to draw some arrows to this dot and say that's a nucleus. And these are stacked cells, or this reminds me of a tire on a car. Like, the labels are actually for you, because this is one of the things that you'll have to study before the practical, is your own notes to remind you, well, this kind of looks like a bicycle tire. We'll see that in a second, some things that remind me of a bicycle tire. So that's what I mean by label. I don't mean scientific labels necessarily, but just like label a couple things that stood out to you that tell you this is stratified cuboidal. This is how I know personally this is stratified cuboidal, because it looks like a bicycle tire. This lab today, next week, can put a lot of work for you, a lot of benefit for you, or it can be worthless. The choice is in your hands, and it's what you choose to do with the actual paper. Okay? Because after this, you'll come here and look at this. Anyways, color change is usually meaningful, right? So we're going from dark purple to bluish purple. That's a different tissue type, so there's some useful things to consider anytime you look at histo. But also, maybe if I zoom in, I mean, we're not going to be able to see it, but we can imagine that at the bottom of this purple, right here, is the basement membrane. So everything superficial to that must be epithelium, because epithelium is adjacent to a basement membrane. Again, I don't like see, I mean, there I do, that sort of dark part. But you may not see that with your eyes. I've done this enough to kind of identify some things. But anyways, my point is like, I know what epithelium is, which you guys should know anyways, because of chapter 1. So you bring that knowledge in and you say, well, this kind of makes sense that there'd be a really stark difference because there's going to be a basement membrane that separates 2 completely different tissues. So this is stratified squamous, because all the way up here at the apical domain, these cells, like this one, are kind of oval and flat. Right? All of those cells are dead. Up here, they're so flat that I can't even pick out the cells from each other. But how would you describe the shape of, let's see, maybe some of these cells? Are those squamous cells, if you can see from where you're sitting? They look flat. That one kind of looks cuboidal, right? I don't care that I look at the apical surface to say this is stratified squamous. Another useful tip for this is you don't have another type of epithelium that is this stratified. All the other stratified epithelium is at most like 2 layers. Okay? If you see layer after layer after layer, you know it's stratified squamous. So I'm going to pan down, so that's a couple. I am now below the epidermis and the dermis, if that helps you. Looking at mostly connective tissue that we'll talk about next time. This is my highest magnification. Okay, so here's where we were. Right, I zoomed in quite a bit. There's where the basement membrane would kind of be. So this is what they're doing. This is something else. What do you think this is? First of all, I see a white space, right? Now I see a white space here too, but this is like contained. So that space is probably real. This space is fake. This is a result of the histology process. This space is real though, and it's contained in a nice circle. So where are my options of tubes? That could be the skin. We know where the skin.
Blood vessel?
Maybe it's a blood vessel of some type. Maybe it's a So by the way, that's a red blood cell. But those cells are flat. This cell, its membrane ends about right there, and then it wraps around and ends about right there. From what I can tell. And then there's the other one. This is a blood vessel, which is where I find simple squamous epithelium. You can get so good at histo that you see the cells and you see the fine details that I'm able to see after years of doing it. Or you can also just know some things about blood vessels. What's the inner lining of a blood vessel? It's always simple squamous epithelium. So if I know this is a blood vessel, and we're in the practical, and I point, I say ID tissue, you're okay, that's simple squamous epithelium, it's easy, right? If I know about blood vessels. And if you combine that with also spending enough time in the lab with what we're actually seeing, then you become pretty darn good. Where do I find blood vessels? Everywhere, right? So in a second, maybe I go to the kidneys to find some other type. I could probably find a blood vessel there. Maybe I look at the tongue for skeletal muscle and stratified squamous. I'm going to find blood vessels, so maybe I can add it there. What type of tissue is this? What do you think these are? Okay, so from here to here is loop. Okay, so what I'm pointing at is just this way, and then just sort of this line. Those are nuclei. The slivers, those are nuclei as well. So not quite cuboidal. Not columnar, because columnar would be very tall. Columnar would be even more stretched out than cuboidal. So if this is a nucleus that's squished flat, what type of epithelium is it? What shape of epithelium is squamous, right? Does this look like it's stratified at all? No, because those are different cells. They're different color even, right? You can have multiple different colors. The colors don't really mean anything to you, especially. So it's not like I can say, oh, this is blue, therefore it is this tissue, is what I mean by that. Oh, this is red, therefore it must be blood cells. But if these cells were the same tissue as this cell, then they would be stained the same way. So within a given slide, if you see color change, you know that something has changed, right? So these are all actually red blood cells. This is a blood vessel, very small arteriole probably, that's in longitudinal section. So we're kind of catching it as it worms through this part of the skin. Okay? So this is still just a blood vessel, simple squamous epithelium. This one's kind of tough. We might find a better sample in a second. But what's this white space probably? What's it called? Starts with an L. It's a lumen. It's different from this other white space because this isn't contained. I can tell that this is a structure, right? So there's this white empty space in the middle of that structure. This is some type of a tube. It's kind of caught at a weird angle when they slice through this skin. What is, if you can, I'm at my highest magnification. Can you see this little circle right here? Right at the tip of that, can you see the circle? I'm gonna have to get more feedback from you guys at some point, or I will decide to just set you loose and just let you look at stuff and hope for the best. Okay, I need to know that this is a good use of your time. So if you can't see something, I need to know that. If you can see it, I need to know that you can see it. There's a circle right here, that's a nucleus. There's a circle right there, that's a nucleus. They're the same color, right? Circle, circle, circle. That's layers of epithelium. And then I go to some other tissue type. So this must be stratified, right? Now, this nucleus, or maybe down here is better because it's darker. There's a really bad one right there. So if you can see those circles maybe, those nuclei are pretty round, right? So there's plenty of room inside the cell for that nucleus to be round. It's not forced to be flat. Therefore, it's not squamous epithelium. The squamous is so flat that the nucleus is also stretched, alright? And then, something else to remember is that in this class, I'm not gonna show you stratified columnar epithelium, okay? That's not gonna be an option that we even look at. There won't be stratified columnar. This is stratified. The nuclei are not flat, therefore it has to be stratified cuboidal epithelium. There's enough space in these cells. Even though I can't see where one cell ends, right? It's so different from the cartoons that you're probably used to seeing. But I can't tell where one cell ends and one cell starts. But I do recognize, okay, those nuclei have plenty of room. And I also know enough about anatomy and physiology to know that this isn't columnar, and it's also can't be squamous because the nuclei are nice. And then I stack them, and so it's stratified, so it has to be stratified. This is a sweat gland, really a sweat duct. And so we're gonna add that to our list actually. Add it at the bottom of page 10. Do like a 4.1 is what we call it, on the bottom of page 10, 4.1, stratified cuboidal. Still in the skin, it's a sweat gland. It looks very different from those blood vessels up here. Not just by size, but mostly the thickness, right? Because it's stratified, it's no longer simple squamous. Okay, questions?
So what we just wrote down, that's that on the board?
Yes. This is stratified cuboidal. It's the only place you'll find it too. If you want to find stratified cuboidal, you have to go get skin. Okay, if I want simple squamous, literally anything with blood vessels, we'll also look at some other examples of it. If I want this heavily stratified squamous, I have to go to skin. But I'll load something else in a second to compare to. Other questions? While we're here, this is a sneak peek to next week, so we'll probably revisit, but I'll remind you of some things that how many of you have had anatomy? Okay. So I'll remind you of some things that you've had in anatomy or histology if you've heard of histology. So up here is all epidermis, stratified squamous. The next layer of the dermis, these papillas, or the papillary layer, that is areolar connective tissue. So next week we'll revisit this on its own, like, hey, here's areolar. But since we're in the skin, and on the practical, I might ask you all to both mix together. Let's make sure we know, guys. So areolar, and then all of a sudden I start seeing this big stuff, right? These big bundles of collagen. So it's areolar to about maybe right here, and then it starts the next layer of the dermis, which is reticular, and that's dense, irregular connective tissue. Take pictures, videos, do whatever you want. Blood vessel, part of the sweat duct, gigantic collagen bundles, which if you remember your kind of basic histo stuff, if it's that big, then you're looking at some type of dense connective tissue. And then I don't see a pattern to any of these fibers, so it's dense, irregular connective tissue. Up here, let me zoom in a little bit. See how this is just kind of wispy, right? Very small blue streaks, very small proteins versus this giant orangish blue collagen bundle. That's areolar. It's very loose. It's mostly water. That's never good. This though, very dense protein fibers. And so that transition from papillary or areolar connective tissue start right there becoming dense. Hey, I don't think there's another type of epithelium though in the skin. What do you think this thing is? What's this space called? The whole thing is clearly something else than what it's swimming in. It's some kind of structure. It's pretty ugly. This isn't the best stain for this I've ever seen. It's not necessarily cut the best, but what do you think those red cells are? They're literally red cells. These are blood cells. This is a blood vessel. It looks different from the other ones because it's a much bigger one. This is a lot of smooth muscle that we'll talk about later. But what's the tissue right here at the surface? Like that cell is a very different point to its dark. What type of tissue is that?
Simple squamous.
Simple squamous. I know that because A, it looks squamous. We don't see stacks and stacks of cells. You might. I recognize that it looks like maybe this is all the same material until like here or something. But this squishiness does not look the same as this thin strip of dark nuclei. Okay? But maybe you struggle with that. Maybe you're resenting me right now. So you're like, no way he's gonna ask that, that's too tough. But it isn't too tough because what do we know about blood vessels? The inner surface is always simple squamous epithelium across the most thick blood vessels. Okay? What type of tissue is this? Stratified squamous epithelium. This slide is labeled stratified squamous epithelium. You might also find, this is probably, I think this might be tongue. This is definitely skeletal muscles. I think this is tongue, or maybe it's the very top part of the pharynx. Or the esophagus. But it's not skin. That's why it looks so different. It's not just the colors, right? In the skin, this thing was super thick. And there were no nuclei really at the very top of it until the cells were dead, right? Your dead skin is soft. This looks very different from that, but it's still stratified squamous. It's just in a protected area like the vaginal mucosa or whatever. Yeah, but that's still stratified squamous. What's always underneath epithelium? Areolar connective tissue. So here's a little bit of areolar connective tissue if you want to think about that. The tongue would be another good place to look for this. I don't know if we have tongue here though. What type of epithelium is that? Simple squamous epithelium. These cells look like, look at that cell compared to that cell. If that, if those look so similar, that means they're gonna be the same type of cell basically. That does look different from these very stretched ones that are clearly making a boundary right here. This is a blood vessel. There's just no blood in it this time. There's a really good one. If I can see just how stretched out those cells are. What type of tissue is that cell? Oh, let's do that one. Is that cell right there? Because I've been asking that one question. Okay, so this white space is the lumen. It doesn't look like anything we've seen before. We're in the kidneys right now. Okay. But I see a very clear boundary here, so it has to be hidden. And I see these very squished cells. So even if I think it's stratified, it's definitely gonna be squamous. And then maybe if you're looking at this, you're like, well, I don't know if this is a cell, and then there's another cell, and then maybe there's three cell layers there, so maybe I think it's stratified. If you're struggling with that, then you can always go back to this list that we're making, which is where do I find stratified squamous? I only find it facing external environments, mucosas and the skin. I don't find it in an organ ever. And so actually this is one type of epithelium, and then there's different kinds. This is the free surface. So like for example right here, this little thin cell, the free surface is right here, this thin white space. For these cells that look like maybe it's stratified, their free surface is up here. So it's just a lot's crammed in. This is called Bowman's capsule. It's in the cortex of the kidney. Simple squamous epithelium. So that's two places that I could ask for simple squamous as blood vessels, and also the kidney. And it's not that I am like, oh, I wish they knew where to go find all these things. it's more, this is clearly simple squamous to me, so regardless of what organ it is, I'm hoping you guys get to that same point, and I'm giving you some tips on, well, here's where you go look for something that looks like this compared to the blood vessels, okay? What about this tissue though? What type of tissue is this? There's the lumen. You can tell there's another lumen right there. If you're sitting close enough, you might even see a little white sliver right there, which means this is one tissue, this is a separate tissue, cramped right next to each other. So focus on just this donut. What type of tissue do you think that is? Simple cuboidal. Okay, and that is probably the best simple cuboidal I can show you outside of the thyroid. Okay, for some kidneys, this is a kidney tubule. Here's the free surface. I go one cell layer and then something changes. There's just a subtle line. I can see the donut, right? So that must be the basement membrane right there, if you can see that. And so it's one cell layer thick. I can't tell really when this cell turns into this cell, but I can see a nice round nucleus. That means there's plenty of cell, and it's not super tall. We'll see columnar epithelium in a second, and you'll realize just how tall those cells are. And it's definitely not squished flat, so it has to be cuboidal. And then maybe the next obstacle is I can't, it's harder to tell if it's stratified or not. Simple cuboidal epithelium, and then a separate simple cuboidal epithelium for this kidney. Simple cuboidal epithelium, and then a separate simple cuboidal epithelium for this kidney. One lumen, its epithelium, basement membrane, squished in between them, a separate simple cuboidal epithelium, got torn to shreds, so ignore that, but second, right? And I will try to find you, on a practical, good example of this stuff. Maybe you see this and you think, that really looks like a blood vessel, because it's just so long. But those nuclei are nice and round. So that's simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay, kidneys, simple squamous, and simple cuboidal. That's all you'll find in this class. What's happening out here? Nothing, right? So this is a boundary. Because again, right now we're focusing on epithelium, but next week we'll add the other tissue types, and then the practical, it'll just be random stuff. And it all might be one nice shade of pink, but gigantic empty space, that's a good sign that I'm going to be looking at some epithelium, because epithelium is in our boundaries. Do we see how this goes from one cell type to just something else all of a sudden? Right, about right there, maybe? Okay, what is this?
Blood vessel.
Blood vessel. I can see blood in it if you're close enough, but also see this flat, especially that one. That's like the most perfect simple squamous epithelial cell I could find for a blood vessel. You can tell it's bending around. That's the pattern that I was seeing even in those bad examples, because I can still see, well, that nucleus is curved to match this with simple squamous. Okay, what are these? Nuclei, right? They're stacked up in a nice row. What is all this though? That's not just nothing, that's also parts of the cells reaching all the way out here to the lumen. This cell goes from here all the way out here, and it's pretty thin. And so it's called, how many layers of cells do we see? Ignore that situation. But how many cell layers do we see out here?
One.
Just one, right? So what type of epithelium is it? Simple columnar. We can find that in a lot of places. This one is small intestine duodenum. If you find anything to do with the digestive system, you'll probably be able to find simple columnar epithelium. Okay, page 10, C5. Mark that out. Also C6. We've already done 1 through 4. We've had some examples. We'll see some more in a second. So D3 on page 10, you can also mark that one out. I'm not going to show you super stratified, although that is kind of cool. this slide says small intestine, and I just told you find intestine and find simple columnar. So maybe you grab this, but it doesn't look anything like what I just showed you. What I showed you was nice and pink. It's very dark. It's obviously got some issues up here from the light. So maybe I'll find simple columnar, and it might not look exactly like what I saw before, or exactly like what I've been reading. Therefore, I get this wrong because I didn't see enough samples. So that's why I want you to spend time in here on your own. But I will try to find each areas that I can pick up, which I might not be able to. Surface, one cell, different cell types. This is areolar or connective tissue, because there's always areolar underneath epithelium. Now, I will admit, that is one nucleus, that is a second nucleus. One, two, these cells are crammed in on top of each other, so it's a little bit more challenging than what we saw before, especially if I look at some of these other spots. Like right here, it kind of looks like maybe that's stratified, but looking at these big nuclei, it goes from here to here for that cell. That is simple columnar. And for the practical, I'm not going to show you pseudostratified or stratified. So even if you are a little confused because there's all these cells, you recognize it, and I'm doing this up here, what tissue is this? If you know it's columnar, because you maybe recognize that these are microvilli, intestine, and that's recognized simple columnar, then you already know it's not one of those other options. It's not stratified columnar or pseudostratified, because we're not even going to look. Well, I can show you. Okay, small intestines. What's the covering around the small intestines called? It's kind of like the covering around the heart, the covering around the lungs. What known as one of the small intestines? What surrounds your lungs? What's the membrane that surrounds your lungs? So that surrounds the heart. Good, yeah. So the pericardium surrounds the heart. The pleura surrounds the lungs. The peritoneum surrounds the small intestine. The layer of the peritoneum that is stuck to those organs, the layer of the serous membrane that's stuck to them, is simple squamous. This is the edge of the intestine. This is all smooth muscle. We'll talk about that more later. I'm going to zoom in. I can't zoom in. You see this cell right here? Looks awfully flat and squished. I don't see too many others because they're so flat that they're stretched out and I don't necessarily see a nucleus everywhere. But that is simple squamous epithelium. If I'm feeling real froggy on the practical, I will ask you that. That cell is not the same as those cells. If for no other reason than those cells are round and that one's squished, there has to be a reason for that. But I'll also on the practical, if I was going to ask that question, I'd give you this context, and maybe it's enough to jog your memory, like this is a whole big organ, now we're at another end, and then I zoom in, and maybe that helps me, okay? Without me zooming in, what type of epithelium is right here? Squamous. What type of epithelium is right here? Look at that, that's a vein, because it's so long. Okay. Does anyone recognize this word? This is the thyroid. What type of tissue is this? Okay, so I have a full nucleus, which implies it's either columnar or cuboidal. I don't see super tall cells. Next obstacle is stratified versus simple. Why is this simple and not stratified? Because there's two, I mean, those are clearly stacked cells, right? Problem is this, cuboidal epithelium is where this one, this is a big space. This one is where this one. And if you're sitting where I am, you can tell that there's some wispiness going on between these. I can actually see, I wish I could zoom in more. But I can see the basement membrane, really, two separate basement membranes squished up. So thyroid is another good place for simple cuboidal. The other place we saw it was the kidney. Thyroid's like the best place for simple cuboidal if you want just like a really clear. Okay, so this is lung, but it's also super cancerous. So it's a little weirder than a normal healthy lung would look. What type of epithelium is this? Squamous. This is two separate simple squamouses on top of each other. This is an alveolus, if that brings back any memories. This is where air is exchanged. In this case, they're seaming trying to tell me each other. So that's the simple squamous epithelium. Okay, one last thing, and then I'll let you guys get started on your drawings and, I'll help you find stuff with your scopes and stuff. Actually, we probably need to talk about how to use a microscope, but, so this is cancerous, so it looks kind of janky, but I think I'll still get the point across. Look at it, I don't know, like this view. This is my lowest magnification, okay? So just kind of burn that into your brain while I find some. It looks slightly similar. Imagine it was the same color, and imagine it wasn't a cancerous one. Okay, it looks kind of similar, but I zoomed in several times, and this is not squamous epithelium, and that nucleus is not a squamous. So, what tissue is this? Do you think? Alright, which I won't do that up to you on the test. I'll be able to zoom in and out. You can ask me even, can you zoom out? Can you zoom in? So maybe you say, can you zoom out? And I say, okay, yeah, this is my lowest magnification. That kind of looks similar to what we just saw, though. It's just a different color. This is adipose. Okay, so that's a little to connect to next week when you're looking at simple squamous in the lungs. The thing that you want to compare it against is just adipose. You might get those confused. Right, that's your goal with the drawing. To draw the thing that makes you know, okay, this is adipose compared to all the other label. I know it's adipose because of maybe just how perfectly round they are or something. Whatever works for you. Because 3 weeks from now, whenever you're checking the practical, you'll forget whatever you were learning right now. Okay. Okay. We will end the discussion and the showing part there unless you want to go back there. We'll do the other two tissue types next week. Let me just real quick. Go through microscope stuff.